Hey there, and welcome to The Gathering YouTube. My name's Maddie, and I'm our online pastor. If this is your first time checking out our channel, welcome. Be sure to head over and click that subscribe button. Messages like the one you're about to watch premiere here every Sunday at 10 a.m. alongside a whole bunch of additional content. Or if you've been hopping around our channel for a while, maybe you've checked out some other videos, I want to invite you to fill out a Connect card. That lets me know that you're here and gives me the opportunity to reach out and say hello. With that, enjoy the message.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Gathering. It's really good to have you in worship. So much is happening, right? Next week, we're going to start Advent here at The Gathering, getting ready for Christmas. This week's Thanksgiving. A lot is going on. I know in your life and mine and in our church and the life of the world. It is a great time, though, to be in church, and I'm really glad that you're here. When I was in high school, this incident happened where this assistant football coach that I was really close with was let go, I think for financial reasons. And I remember I was really mad, I was frustrated, I didn't agree with the decision, but I didn't really know what to do with it. And there was this senior night assembly where I was asked to speak about something nice, I think, but instead I sort of hijacked the moment and surprised everyone when I blasted the administration for the choice they made, one that I thought was the wrong choice. It caused a bunch of turmoil. And I look back on that and I think, maybe that wasn't the best way to deal with that. But the truth was I really didn't know how to deal with people that I disagreed with. I hadn't really ever been taught. In fact, I wish I would have had some tools, some strategies before that incident instead of many years later when I actually learned a few. Today, we are ending our series 1, Finding Unity in a Divided World. And I've really tried to keep this series practical, not so much theoretical for big things out there, but for the kind of relationships every day where we have to deal with people that we disagree with, where there's division between us. If you were here in week 1, I talked about what unity is and isn't. Unity isn't uniformity, all of us being the same. It's not unanimity, all of us agreeing. It's not unity, all of us having to always be together. And instead, I defined unity this way. I said unity is maintaining a posture of love across difference. That's the way the Bible, I think, talks about unity. Last week, if you were here, I talked about the way in which that love isn't a feeling or an emotion, it's an action. And so we can choose to act in a loving way, even with people that really frustrate us or that we think are wrong. And I talked about 3 practices that Paul points out about how we do that. We talked about humility and gentleness and patience. Well, today I want to end this series by giving you some really practical tools for sort of how to approach or how to deal with difficult people in your life. Because I think, like me, most of us have never really been taught ways that we can deal with people that we disagree with. In the early 70s, there were 2 researchers who actually did some work on this. They studied the way that different people deal with conflict and deal with people across division and disagreement. And they concluded that there are 5 distinct and different strategies or ways of dealing with conflict or disagreement in our life. All of it depends on the situation and the nature of the relationship that you have with the person. Today, this tool is named the Thomas-Kilmann conflict instrument after the 2 guys, those 2 researchers. And it's actually been taught to millions of people, teams, individuals, even politicians. It's used with diplomats in geopolitical situations, in workplaces with teams. It's even used in families and even between friends. But it's 5 strategies for how to deal with disagreement. But long before these researchers ever named these things, we actually see all 5 of these strategies lived out in the life of Jesus. Jesus both practiced them and encouraged his disciples to think about how to use them in different situations in their own life. So today, what I want to do is I'm going to go through these tools. I'm going to give you 5 different ways of dealing with people that are difficult, disagreement, even deep divisions in some of your relationships, in the hopes that these tools will help you when you find yourself in one of these situations. Maybe even this week around a Thanksgiving table. By the way, I have to say before I get into this, I love it when, Jesus thousands of years before sort of proves social science today, and those two things sort of come together. And that's exactly what we have here. So what are these strategies? Well, the first way of dealing with difference is to accommodate. Sometimes the best way to deal with a conflict or a disagreement in our life is to just accommodate. What does that mean? Well, basically, accommodate means to sort of give in. Or I'll put it this way. We accommodate when we decide that the relationship is more important than the disagreement. Does that make sense? We accommodate when we decide that the relationship is much more important than the disagreement, so we let the disagreement go. To take an example from a story that Jesus tells, one time Jesus was arbitrating a fight. People were fighting over who's the greatest. I mean, it's kind of a stupid fight. Who's most important. And in Jesus' day, the more important you were, the better seat you got at an important function like a banquet or a wedding. And so people would fight over who gets the most important seat. And Jesus' disciples argued about who's the most important. And Jesus says this. He says in Luke chapter 14, instead, when you receive an invitation, go in and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he'll say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you'll be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. I mean, essentially, Jesus said, this is a stupid thing to fight about. In fact, if people want to argue about who's most important, let them have the great seat. You don't need it. Just go and sit in the least important seat. This fight is not a fight that's worth having. Truth is, sometimes the conflict or the disagreement that we have with someone is really not worth the relationship that we have with them. And this is true, I think, especially with close friends and family. We have a tendency, especially with those close to us, like those that we live with, maybe a spouse, a partner, our kids, we have a tendency to fight over the most kind of mundane, sort of stupid, everyday things, don't we? And sometimes when we get locked into one of these conflicts, we let little things have this sort of outsized place in our relationship. This can be especially true in a marriage where often I've found that accommodation is the best way to deal with certain conflicts. I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, kind of on the end of COVID, Jess and I decided to do some work in our kitchen, kind of remodel some things like a lot of other people. And all of a sudden, we're in the midst of remodeling, and I was asked to have an opinion about things that I had never thought about up until that point, like the color of and the shape of backsplash tile, or what pattern the floor was going to have, or what the countertops were going to look like. And of course, every time I'm presented with something, I always have an opinion. I had an opinion, Jess had an opinion. Very often, those opinions did not match, and we found ourselves, a little bit at loggerheads. And if you've ever had experience with this, what I found out is sometimes I'd realize, this thing is not that big of a deal, certainly not as big of a deal as my marriage. I learned the wisdom, sometimes too late, that the best way to deal with this is just accommodate, say, that's fine, to give up what we want for the sake of a relationship. So the first strategy is to accommodate when we discover that the fight is not worth how important the relationship is to us. The second way of dealing with conflict is to avoid. Avoid means just that we don't engage. Instead, we choose to ignore it, to walk away from it, to disengage from this fight and the relationship. We avoid when we decide that the relationship isn't healthy and the conflict is too great, and that neither one of them are really worth engaging anymore. And you might be thinking, Matt, avoid? Surely Jesus would not want us to avoid conflict with other people, but he actually does. In certain situations, Jesus even recommends it, even for his followers. Listen to this. This is Matthew chapter 10. He says, when you go into a house, say peace. And if the house is worthy, give it your blessing of peace. But if the house isn't worthy, take back your blessing. If anyone refuses to welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or that city. I think what Jesus is getting at here is, yes, if there's a relationship to be had, have the relationship. But sometimes you are going to run into certain people where they clearly are not interested in you. They're clearly not welcoming to you. They're clearly, not really people that are going to be good to you, in that case, shake the dust off your feet and just keep on moving. See, the truth is there are certain relationships that are so fraught that sometimes the healthiest thing that we can do is just not engage that other person. Sometimes shaking the dust off and avoiding that person and that conflict is the best way that we can maintain sort of a posture of love in the midst of that relationship. I'll bring this home a little bit. A question that I've been asked a lot, even during this series, and some of you maybe have been thinking about it, is, Matt, I hear all this talk about unity, but what about a person that you don't just disagree with, but that actually wants to do you harm or who has harmed you? What about a person whose opinions are actually a threat to your physical or your emotional or mental health? What do you do with that kind of person? A person so toxic that I don't even want to be around them. What does unity look like then? And my answer is essentially this strategy. It's avoid. I mean, that's a hard answer. But this is true, that sometimes we have to avoid a relationship and a person, especially when the best way for us to be well and safe is to not engage with that other person at all. In those kinds of situations, we have to draw sometimes a hard boundary. We have to cut off a relationship. We have to walk away. We have to shake the dust off of our feet. We have to avoid this person. And while it may sound really counterintuitive, sometimes that hard boundary, sometimes deciding we're not going to engage that person or that conflict is the best way for us to listen to Jesus and to maintain some semblance of a posture of love towards them instead of hate or revenge or violence or fighting. It's a regrettable reality, I think, in our lives, but it's one that even Jesus admits is sometimes necessary. So the second strategy is to avoid. The third strategy is to compete. And competing is just what it sounds like. It means we want to fight for something that we think is right. I don't mean literally fight, of course, but competing is when we decide the disagreement is important enough to risk the relationship. I mean, because let's be real, sometimes the stakes are really high. Sometimes we have to speak up. We have to push back. We have to contend for, sort of fight for a perspective that we think is true and right. And we see this famously even in Jesus' own life. I mean, toward the end of his life, he goes into Jerusalem and he goes to the temple. I mean, the place that is supposed to be where God resides, meant for the worship of God. And he sees all of these people, the money changers especially, who are exploiting and taking advantage of others, especially poor people who are coming to worship. And it says this in Matthew chapter 21, then Jesus went into the temple and threw out all those who were selling and buying there. He pushed over the tables used for currency exchange and the chairs of those who sold doves. He said to them, it's written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a hideout for crooks. I mean, here Jesus was mad, yes, but Jesus really pushes back and risks the kind of relationship you might have with these people in order to demonstrate that God hates exploitation, that it's not right to take advantage of other people. And I think oftentimes we find ourselves in a situation like this. Maybe like it's times when we're in a group and we find that the group holds a position that we don't hold and that we don't think is right. And we begin to feel like it's our obligation to speak up or to push back, even if it risks us looking like the outsider. I remember one time a couple was telling me they were in a Sunday school class. And they said, Matt, in the Sunday school class, everyone in the class shares like a political perspective that we don't share. And oftentimes in the class, it devolves into a conversation about politics, and people are saying things that we just really disagree with, we think is really wrong. And we're really trying to decide whether we speak up because we feel like we need to. But if we speak up, it's going to alienate us as the odd people out, and it's going to maybe even risk our relationships and our friendships with some of these people. And I get that. I mean, I read another article recently that said, just don't ever talk about politics or religion, especially at Thanksgiving. They were kind of warning people pre-Thanksgiving. But for some of us, I mean, politics and religion gets at deeply held values, things that we don't want to stay quiet about, that we can't always stay quiet about. Sometimes to be silent feels like complicity, like we're somehow agreeing with whatever is being said. And the truth is, sometimes, not saying anything or not speaking up is sort of like ignoring or papering over those disagreements for kind of a false sense of peace. Sometimes we have to speak up. Sometimes we have to confront, to contend for, compete for what we think is right and good, even if it risks a relationship. So that's the third strategy. Fourth strategy is to compromise. And of course, this is what we often think of when it comes to a disagreement. Compromise is what happens when everyone gets a little something and gives a little something up. It's kind of finding a common ground for the sake of being able to move forward in a relationship. And of course, compromise is always not getting everything you want, but getting enough of what you want that you're able to move on with another person. And compromise has kind of fallen on hard times in our culture. It's often criticized as weak or sort of caving in on a principle, not being strong. But we see Jesus recommend compromise, especially in certain kinds of situations, sometimes those large-scale situations that don't have an easy outcome. Consider a political issue in Jesus' own day, one that his opponents tried to draw him into. The issue was taxes. Some things don't change that much. And who are we supposed to pay taxes to? This is what happened. This is Matthew chapter 22. It says, "So tell us what you think." These are Jesus' opponents. "Does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Knowing their evil motives, Jesus replied, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used to pay the taxes." And they brought him a denarius. "Whose image and inscription is this?" he asked. "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and God what belongs to God." The truth is, this was sort of a compromised position. There were certain people who were all in on the Roman Empire, and they demanded that you show loyalty to the Roman Empire. They wanted Jesus to unequivocally say, "Oh yeah, no, pay your taxes. Do whatever Caesar wants." There were other people that hated Caesar and thought the Roman Empire was wrong and unjust and thought you shouldn't pay a cent to Caesar. You should reject that in view of God. And here Jesus sort of navigates this middle road. Give to Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, God the things that belong to God. It was a situation that probably wasn't fully satisfying to either camp. Everyone got a little something that they agreed with and a little something that that really challenged them. This was kind of a compromise. And the truth is, oftentimes in our personal lives, I think we have to come to compromises with certain people. I've heard the phrase used, maybe you've heard it, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And the truth is, in many situations in personal relationships, the other person isn't perfect, but they're good enough for us to move forward in relationship with. So sometimes we can't get to a perfect resolution in the midst of a disagreement, but we can get to something that's good. And we don't want to throw out what could be a good relationship just because it isn't the perfect one. I'll use I think a really important example. I was speaking with a young woman recently who came out to her parents, and she was really struggling with do I go home for Thanksgiving? And it's a struggle that more and more people have for various reasons. So I asked her, well, how did it go when you came out? And she said, my mom didn't really react completely the way I wanted her to. She didn't say the things that I really hoped that she would say, but she did pretty good. In fact, the phrase she used was kind of good enough. Her mom said, "I don't understand this. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I love you." And the young woman said something to me that I thought was profound. She said, the answer wasn't perfect, but I think it was good enough for me to be able to go home. Sometimes this is the reality in some of our hard relationships over disagreement. The disagreement is still there, but we can reach a place where the relationship is good enough for us to be able to move forward. Compromise means we don't get everything we want in a certain situation or in a certain disagreement, but we get enough that we can move forward, at least in a healthy way, in relationship. And in our everyday life, I think compromise is a way of realizing that that many situations aren't going to be perfect, but they can be good. And then the last strategy that we're called to consider is to collaborate. And this last strategy, I think, is the ideal one. In an ideal world, this is how every conflict and every disagreement would be dealt with, at least if Jesus had his way. Collaboration happens when we truly engage each other, engage people that we disagree with. We share and we listen, and then we find a way forward together. Collaboration is a path that preserves what's most important to both people while also strengthening their relationship. It's like a true win-win situation. And collaboration is great, especially when you have strong perspectives and a strong relationship, and you want both to be true going forward. In the Gospels, we see Jesus actually all the time, more than we realize, not ignore or fight with people that he disagrees with, but Jesus usually tries to first engage them, even people that he really disagrees with. And in fact, I'm surprised at how patient Jesus is with people that he clearly believes are wrong, and yet he tries as hard as he can to have a relationship. One of my favorite examples is Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus, if you don't know, was a uber-rich tax collector. And the only way you got to be super rich tax collector is when you exploited and took advantage of all sorts of people, especially poor people. I mean, so this was not a good guy. And yet one time Jesus goes into town and he decides to engage and stay with Zacchaeus, a choice that clearly angered everybody else. Listen, this is Luke 19. It says, when Jesus came to that spot, he looked up. He said, Zacchaeus, come down at once. I must stay at your home today. So Zacchaeus came down at once, happy to welcome Jesus. Everyone who saw this grumbled, saying, he's gone to be the guest of that guy, a sinner. And this would have been terrible. Jesus didn't just go visit, he stayed with him. Now, we don't know the nature of the conversations, but over that 24, 48, or however long Jesus was there, they must have sat around a table over many meals and shared and listened and talked. And Jesus decided to engage this person he deeply disagreed with. And he does this all over the place in the Gospels. We don't know what they talked about, but we know that in the end, Zacchaeus was changed. Their relationship was strengthened. Zacchaeus was a follower. Jesus came away preserving what's most important. And I think Jesus with us encourages us that when it's possible, where it's possible, try to work through your disagreements. Try to listen and to share. Try to have humility and understanding. Give that thing some time. We shouldn't give up the hope that a lot of times we can actually move through and even beyond our disagreements to a place that can actually strengthen our relationship and preserve what's most important to us. In fact, oftentimes when you lean in the places of division and disagreement, when you actually do the hard work, and it is hard work, the benefit can be understanding, sometimes forgiveness, changed hearts, new perspectives, and often stronger relationships than you had before you brought that thing up. And so I think the ideal strategy, whenever it's possible, is to collaborate. But friends, those are 5 tools. Accommodate, avoid, compete, compromise, collaborate, and each of them can be the right and the faithful decision in particular situations. These are all ways that Jesus actually practiced loving even across difference, and he offers them to us as we navigate those disagreements in our own life. So here's my prayer. That some of you, maybe even this week, are going to have to, navigate some tense relationships. Maybe over the next month at work or in some other area of life, you have to navigate things that are tough. In the coming year, we're going to have a year of politics, an election year, where we're going to have all sorts of disagreements on a national scale and all the way down to a personal scale. My prayer for all of us, I think, is that we would have the patience and the wisdom to remember that there are a lot of ways that we can deal with these disagreements, these 5 tools being some of them. But at a basic level, our responsibility to unity is to seek in every situation to love across difference. And all the while, I want you to remember Paul's words, ones that I read last week, that if possible, as far as it depends on you, seek to live in peace with all people. Let's pray. Gracious and holy God, you know what we have to deal with, who we're struggling with, what relationships are hard right now. You know what divisions in the world and in our workplace, at school, in our lives is causing us stress. And my prayer is that you would just give us wisdom. Help us to know the best way to deal with situations as they come up. Help us as best we can to seek to collaborate, to lean in, to work in and through disagreements. But if it's not possible, help us to remember that it is okay. It's okay sometimes to seek out other strategies and to do what we can in any given situation to maintain a posture of love. So God, this week even, give us wisdom to know how to deal with people that we disagree with in our life, all the while helping us to maintain a posture of love. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks for checking out our message. Before you go, be sure to head over to our channel and click the subscribe button. And if you liked the video, feel free to share it with a friend. Invite them to come and watch with you. If you have been checking out our channel for a little while, I also want to invite you to fill out a Connect card. I would love the chance to reach out and say hello. Now, every time we gather together, either in person or online, we celebrate in a moment of generosity as a church. We believe that when we're generous with what we have, we both leave ourselves open to what God wants to do in our life, and we get to participate in what God is doing in the lives of others. If you're interested in learning more about our church and the way we support our community and beyond it, you can head to our description and check out our website. The ways to give are going to be up on the screen, as well as a link in our description, and I want to invite you to participate in that now. And friends, with that, that's the message. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in listening and singing along to the Gathering worship team, you can find those videos as well as a virtual communion experience on our channel's homepage. Until next time, go in peace.